Welcome in. So today we're diving into a ton of RoleCatcher guides, all about residential home adult care workers. And we're really going beyond the surface here. It's not just about what the job is, but who these folks are, you know?
It's a special kind of person, that's for sure. I mean, reading through these guides, it really struck me about we're talking about caring for people at honestly some of their most vulnerable moments.
Right, and the guides don't shy away from that at all. I mean, they're upfront about the demands, the potential for burnout.
Yeah.
But before we get into the heavier stuff, you mentioned something before we started recording that really piqued my interest, this whole person-centered approach. What's that about?
So it's kind of like imagine you're not just there to check boxes, right? It's about actually collaborating, like really collaborating with the person you're supporting, their family, even the doctors, to make a care plan that truly fits them. So yeah, no cookie cutter stuff here. It's got to be adaptable to each person and their goals.
Okay, so that makes sense in theory, but like, can you give me an example? What does that actually look like in a real residential home?
Sure. So the guides actually have this example, right? Say you have a resident who loves to garden, but physically they just can't handle a whole garden plot anymore. So instead of just being like, nope, no more gardening, a person-centered approach would be, well, how can we adapt this? Maybe raised beds, special tools. They even mentioned bringing in like a horticultural therapist. Can you believe that?
Wow. Okay, so it's about getting creative to maintain people's quality of life, not just their like bare necessities.
Yeah, exactly. And that actually requires a whole other set of skills. The guides actually highlight critical thinking as like super important, but not in the way you might think. Like it's not about being a math whiz. It's more about constantly assessing these situations, picking up on those little cues from the residents. You got to be able to adapt on the fly.
Man, that makes you realize this is way more than just a job. It's like, I don't know, emotional gymnastics or something. Always got to be on your toes.
Yeah, and that's where the burnout risk comes in. The guides are they're pretty real about that. But, and this is a big but, they also say that the same things that make this work so demanding are the things that make it incredibly rewarding for the right person.
So you're saying like the potential for burnout is almost built into the job description,
Yeah.
but so is the potential for like real deep fulfillment.
Exactly. Like some of the sample interview questions they have in these guides, they're tough. Things like, how would you handle a resident who's getting really agitated? You
Mm.
can't just fake that. You either have the empathy and patience for that or you don't.
Okay, that's a good point. And actually, I did want to get into those interview questions because I was kind of blown away by how specific they got. Like it's one thing to say, "Oh, I'm a caring person," but it's another thing to prove it when you've got like a stressed out family member questioning everything you do, right?
Oh, absolutely. And the guides, they don't hold back at all. One question that really stood out to me was, describe a time you had to advocate for someone who couldn't advocate for themselves. I mean, that says it all right there. You're not just a caregiver, you're often a voice for people who literally can't speak up for themselves.
Wow. Yeah, that adds like a whole other level of responsibility, almost a legal and ethical aspect to it.
You're
Yeah.
right. And it also shows how crucial ongoing training is. The guides are really clear about this not being one of those fields where you learn it all and you're done. I mean, best practices change, new challenges pop up, especially with all the technology coming into play now. There's always something new to learn, you know?
Yeah, and that's what I love about these deep dives.
All right, mate.
Speaking of new challenges, before we get too deep into the interview stuff, I want to circle back to something we briefly talked about, technology's impact on this whole field. Because on the one hand, you have these very human skills that are essential, but then on the other hand, tech is changing everything so fast.
Yeah. It's such a weird paradox, right? And it's something the role catcher guides just barely touch on. Like, they were written before the pandemic, so while they mention telehealth and some remote monitoring, they don't quite capture how quickly things are changing now.
That's true, and that's exactly why we're here to unpack all of this. So before we get into those interview questions, what are your initial thoughts on how technology is already changing the game for residential home adult care workers?
Well, I think the most immediate impact is, well, I think the most immediate impact is on like the day-to-day work itself, you know? Like all those tasks that could be made easier, quicker. Think about medication reminders, keeping track of vital signs, even some of the personal care stuff. Technology could really free up care workers to focus on that human connection, which, let's be honest, that's something a machine can't replace.
Okay, but doesn't that bring up another question? Like, how comfortable are residents with all this technology being, integrated into their lives. We're talking about a generation that didn't exactly grow up with smartphones glued to their hands.
Yeah. And that is a huge factor that these guides don't really address, honestly. Because it's not just about, having the technology available. It's about digital literacy for both the residents and the people caring for them. Imagine a resident who's like really resistant to using a new telehealth system. The care worker needs the skills to deal with that, to explain it in a way that makes sense, maybe even advocate for other solutions if it's really causing someone distress.
So it's almost like adding a whole other layer to that person-centered approach we were talking about. It's not just about like customizing the care plan itself, but also how technology fits into it or doesn't.
Exactly. And that actually brings up something else. Data privacy. These guides were written before AI, and all that predictive analytics stuff really took off in healthcare, right? So imagine a future where every single thing a resident does, every heartbeat is being tracked and analyzed. That's kind of wild, right? What are the ethics of that? How do we balance all this cool innovation with protecting people's basic privacy and dignity?
Okay, yeah, those are some big questions. It makes you wonder, are these guides even still relevant with technology changing so rapidly?
See, that's the thing about good foundational material, right? It gives you these core principles that you can build on, even as the specifics change around you. Remember those interview questions we were talking about? The skills they're testing for empathy, problem solving, communication, those are timeless. It doesn't matter if you're using some fancy app or like a good old-fashioned notepad. Those skills always matter.
Right. The fundamentals don't change, even if the tools do.
Hmm.
But it makes you realize that someone going into this field today, they've got to be ready to adapt constantly.
Absolutely. And I bet employers are looking for that specifically. Like, if I were interviewing someone for this kind of role now, I'd ask them straight up, how do you see technology impacting residential care in the next 5 years? I'd want to hear them talk about the good and the bad, because that shows me they're thinking critically, not just jumping on every new gadget that comes along.
Okay, back to those RoleCatcher questions. One that really jumped out at me was, how do you handle a situation where a resident refuses care, even if it's in their best interest?
Mm.
That's a tough one because you're trying to balance respecting their autonomy with, making sure they're safe and healthy.
And that's where those core communication skills are so crucial. The guides really emphasize active listening, yeah, but also de-escalation techniques, understanding body language. Those aren't things you can just learn in a one-day workshop. It takes real experience and a genuine desire to connect with the person, beyond the behavior.
And probably a ton of patience, especially if you're working with someone who's, say, cognitively impaired or prone to agitation.
Oh, for sure. Actually, the guides have this one anecdote that's really powerful. It's about this care worker who was struggling with a resident who just point blank refused to bathe. So instead of forcing the issue, she starts asking about the resident's life. And it turns out she'd been a hairdresser when she was younger. So the care worker, she shifts gears completely, starts talking about shampoos, hairstyles, even brings in some nice smelling oils to create a spa-like vibe.
Wow, that's incredible. So instead of a power struggle, it becomes this moment of connection and respect.
Exactly. It's about remembering that even in those challenging moments, you're dealing with a human being with their own history, their preferences. Their whole story is informing how they're acting. And sometimes finding that common ground is way more effective than any, clinical technique.
That story really brings to life something else the guides talk about, how important creativity is in this line of work. It's not just about following a rule book. It's about thinking outside the box to figure out what each individual needs.
100%. In fact, the guides actually recommend that aspiring care workers volunteer in lots of different settings, hospitals, senior centers, even homeless shelters.
Yeah.
Because it exposes you to such a wider range of challenges, helps you build those adaptability muscles. It's not just about padding your resume, it's about developing that compassionate problem-solving mindset.
So someone who's naturally curious, who genuinely enjoys connecting with people from all walks of life, those are really valuable traits in this field.
Oh, absolutely. And that actually leads to another important point that the guides bring up, self-reflection. This isn't a career for someone who just wants to punch in and punch out. You're dealing with some heavy stuff, big emotions, ethical dilemmas. Being able to process those experiences, to recognize your own biases, and to ask for support when you need it, that's what separates the good from the great.
So it's almost like emotional intelligence is just as important as clinical knowledge in this field, if not more so.
I'd argue it's more important. The guides even talk about the importance of, and I love this phrase, holding space for residents, especially those who are, nearing the end of life. That's not something you learn from a textbook. It's about being okay with sitting with difficult emotions, being fully present, and honestly, being okay with not having all the answers.
Wow. Yeah, that's powerful. And it really makes you realize this work is about so much more than just physical care. It's about emotional support and even spiritual support, I guess.
Absolutely. And that actually brings us to a topic that I think is often overlooked, the spiritual dimension of caregiving.
Spiritual support. That's not something you see every day in a job description. So what do these role catcher guides actually say about that whole aspect of caregiving?
It's funny, they don't actually use the word spiritual directly, but it's kind of woven throughout. Like there's this one section about honoring a resident's life story and another that mentions creating opportunities for reminiscence and legacy work. And it's not just about like feel-good activities, it's about acknowledging that deeper meaning people find in their lives, especially as they get older or face health challenges.
So it's about recognizing that a person's well-being isn't just about their physical health. It's their emotional needs,
Yeah.
and even you could say their existential needs,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. It goes way beyond just checking off tasks on a list. It's about real human connection. Actually, there's a story in one of the guides that really stuck with me. It's about this care worker who found out that one of her residents, he had been an amazing pianist when he was younger, but because of arthritis, he hadn't played in years. So she actually goes out and finds him a keyboard with weighted keys and the look on his face when he sits down and starts playing again. I mean, talk about a powerful moment. Those are the kinds of things that go beyond just the day-to-day caregiving. They become truly transformative experiences.
That gives me chills just hearing you tell that story. It
Mm.
speaks of the power of really seeing the person you're caring for, not just like their diagnosis or their limitations, but who they are deep down.
And that brings us back to what we were saying about technology, right? It's so easy to think that all these gadgets and algorithms will be the answer to everything. But ultimately, it's that human connection that really matters. The best care workers, the ones who are truly great at what they do, they understand that technology is just a tool. It's the heart and the intention behind it that makes all the difference.
It's like you could have the most advanced robot in the world delivering someone's medication, but it's never going to replace the warmth of a human hand holding yours or someone reading you your favorite poem in a familiar voice.
Exactly. And honestly, that's what I hope people take away from this whole conversation. Technology is going to keep changing things, no doubt. But at its core, residential care is about human connection. It always has been, and it always will be.
I couldn't agree more. And honestly, this whole deep dive has really been eye-opening. So to wrap things up, if there was one thing you want our listeners to remember about residential home adult care workers, what would it be?
It's pretty simple, but it's important. Never underestimate the power of human connection. It's at the heart of compassionate care. And like I said, that's something technology can never replace.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.